Hello everyone, it is Friday, Insta Live on Fry. It's Audrey Button from Safe Harbors of the Finger Lakes. I use the pronoun she, her, hers, and we'll get started for Friday at 2 p.m. on the dot. So before we get into the topic, we're going to be talking about domestic violence and mental health. I'm going to be mostly focusing on the impact of domestic violence on mental health. So we'll kind of get into that in a second here. Thank you, Sarah. You're always my number one fan. So before we kind of get into that, and I want to, give a reminder quick, it is Suicide Prevention Month, and then it's also Self-Care Awareness Month as well, which is why it's really important to talk about these things as well. I know we talked about setting boundaries last week, so if you didn't catch that one, definitely check it out. It's on our Instagram page and our YouTube channel. So just, before we get started, just some household keeping items. So I always like to give a content warning, as some of the material I may be discussing may be sensitive to some, so please, please, please take care of yourself however you need to. And then also, I always like to give a quick disclaimer. The views and opinions expressed in this video are not necessarily those of Safe Harbors of the Finger Lakes, but of those in the video. So with that, we will go ahead and kind of get into it. And I want to, remind people about why this is so important. Violence and mental health often go hand in hand. And I know we'll be talking about sexual violence and mental health at the end of the month. It's going to be similar things that you might see in terms of like the response, what happens after they're experiencing those things in mental health and, trauma that they've experienced from those events. But we'll talk about that at the end of the month. So I know next week we're going to talk about burnout for like self-care related stuff, and then we'll talk about sexual violence and the impact on mental health as well. So with that, we'll go ahead and get into it. So remember, domestic violence, dating violence, and mental health and what that looks like. So I really want to clarify that mental illness does not solely cause a partner to be abusive in a relationship. A mental illness is not an excuse for being abusive towards a partner or somebody in your life. But you might see these hand in hand with each other, mental illness and violence. But it doesn't mean that's an excuse for their behavior, how they treat you. It's just something to be aware of. So I want to point that out, and it's not your fault. You're not, responsible for their mental health. Only they are. Okay? So with that, a few diagnoses, that can increase the risk of abusive patterns to show up in a relationship. This can happen. It can make them more irritable. It depends on the mental health, illness diagnoses. Certain things might make them more apt to act out or react and maybe use violence. That also doesn't mean it's an excuse for what they do. It's just something to be aware of. So those tend to go hand in hand. Mental illnesses often impact all areas of a person's life. So, work environment, their personal relationships, their relationship with themselves, and, all that stuff. So just, mental illness impacts multiple areas in that person's life. So abusers, to differentiate domestic violence and mental illness a little bit, abusers tend to only show abusive and unhealthy behaviors around their partner. And this is an intentional thing. So if they're, showing these behaviors around everybody, then maybe it's also mental illness is kind of going on. And I mean, obviously, I'm not a professional in terms of diagnosing people, or, you are. It's just something to be aware of. Abusers who tend to only use these behaviors around their partner do that intentionally. And, it's a part of their mask that they wear. They want to obviously look a certain way to everybody else, but they're only going to use those abusive or present these abusive behaviors around you. Okay, and that's often intentional. This often makes the victim and survivor feel isolated, like no one's going to understand or believe them because, they act fine around friends or family or out in public. But once you are in an isolated area, they treat like completely different. They're unpredictable. They're like a completely different person. And they feel this, that no one will believe them if they say anything, and that they're completely alone, because they're the only one experiencing this side of this other person. And often you see this in forms of gaslighting. And I know we've spoken about gaslighting before. It's a psychological tactic used by abusers to make them feel like they're isolated, alone, that no one believes them, that it's their fault. Maybe they'll blame them for acting out that way, that they're a completely different person when they're with you, or whatever it may be. And that's a common form of abuse and manipulation that abusers will use to maintain that power and control. Okay, and it is your partner's responsibility to seek out that help if they are struggling with a mental illness, or manage that mental illness. So, if they're not going to therapy, if they're not taking medication, if they're not, doing that self-care, things like that, that's on them. One can do so much to help them. You can be there and support them and encourage them to do these things, but the only person responsible for them is themselves, okay? And, they're the only ones that can be accountable for their own behavior. So, common effects of abuse can include, post-traumatic stress disorder, so PTSD. So often symptoms of PTSD might include, wanting to isolate yourself, mood swings, flashbacks, insomnia, and self-destructive behavior. PTSD is often a very common response to trauma, and that's something to be aware of. Depression's another common, result of, abuse and trauma as well. It's just you have those persistent feelings of sadness, loss of interest in things. This often can lead to changes in sleep, appetite, changes in energy levels, changes in concentration, maybe daily behavior, and thoughts of suicide might also occur. And then same with anxiety. People might develop anxiety from this, especially if you're on the end, experiencing this domestic violence. Develop anxiety because your partner is unpredictable. You never know what's going to happen next. You're walking on eggshells. Anxiety might even be a result of this trauma and domestic violence, okay, that you're experiencing. And often people who are anxious, just have some general anxiety about everyday, everything type of situations, or they might have these or sudden attacks, anxiety attacks that they might experience. And in general, just generally speaking, people, the result of, being exposed to violence and being traumatized, there's a general experience of, low self-esteem, self-worth, especially in domestic violence. The abuser might make them feel like it's always their fault, that they're not good enough, no one else will love them, things like that. And that will decrease your self-esteem and self-worth. And, they're tending to isolate and shut people out of your life, especially good support systems. That's a common tactic used by abusers as well. Maybe you're not doing things that you once enjoyed doing. That could be a part of your self-care. So if you're not taking care of yourself, that's most likely gonna, not improve your mental well-being, okay? And not trusting others. They're taught not to trust others. Maybe they're not sure who will believe them. Or maybe they've tried to tell people and they didn't believe them, so they don't trust them anymore because they like, oh, well, they're fine when, I'm around. They don't understand that they're a completely different person around them, okay? And often people who experience trauma and go through these, struggle with these mental illnesses or experiences often, have self-destructing, unhealthy coping mechanisms. And that's due to not learning the proper, healthy coping mechanisms. So these are quick fixes to stress oftentimes, so drugs, alcohol, over or under eating, smoking, unsafe sex, and so forth. Anything that's a quick fix to stress and that's going to make you feel good in that short period of time. And long term, it's not going to make you feel good. Okay? And so people who've experienced trauma often have a constant fight or flight response, which actually is going to wear down your body physically and obviously mentally over time. So you have an increased chance of experiencing a lot of stress related and chronic physical illnesses and mental illnesses due to these this constant fight or flight response, okay? And some examples of those chronic illnesses are your PTSD, depression, stuff like that, but also, experiencing obesity, diabetes, STDs from the unsafe sex that they're doing, heart disease, cancer, stroke, so forth, anything like that, any stress-related physical illnesses as well. So I know we covered a lot, but it's just something to be aware of on how much this can impact people, and that even if abusers, you think that they're, not taking care of themselves, have a mental illness, that is not an excuse for abuse, and that you're not also responsible for them either. And oftentimes abusers use that against their partner, saying, I will harm myself if you leave me, stuff like that. And that's often a very common tactic that abusers might use, and that's not okay. I mean, the best thing you can do is make sure that obviously that you're safe, and then, reaching out to local resources for help. So like Safe Harbors, you could always call us and ask for help with that kind of situation. You can do a welfare check on them. You could call and make sure that they, have someone come and check on them, encouraging them to call and ask for help. But you should never feel responsible for their well-being. That's up to them. So that's just something to be aware of. And, just thinking about how much, domestic violence impacts people, not just, people think of it physically, it's also a lot of mentally, psychologically impacting people. So with that, we will end today, and I really appreciate you all tuning in and checking out this video, and then so make sure you tune in next week. So if you ever need help, you want to talk to somebody, have questions, comments, concerns, you can call our 24-hour hotline, which is 800-247-7273. You can always check us out on our website, which is www.shflny.org. All right, thank you so much. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you next week.